Okay, now at about the same time as the court is handing down this decision, there's also a presidential election going on. And I'm not going to tell you details about every presidential election because some of them are quite mundane. This actually is the only time in the history of the Republic that the electoral system works the way the framers imagined that it would work. So it's worth looking at. Now, there is actually kind of a national party system, but by this time, there's only really one party, the National Republicans or Democratic Republicans. They don't need to call themselves anything because there's no opposition. James Monroe, as I said, was reelected almost unanimously. One elector voted for John Quincy Adams, just so Washington would be the only unanimous choice, but Monroe is following the tradition of not seeking another term, and so there is great interest in intrigue about who will be his successor. And they don't have national conventions. There isn't a national Republican convention. There isn't a primary campaign. You have instead a number of different ways people become candidates for president. One, there is a congressional caucus. The members of Congress from that party choose who the candidate will be. And often this is a subject of great intrigue. In 1808 and 1812, there had been a very fierce fight in the congressional caucus between James Monroe and James Madison, for example. So the congressional caucus chooses, who they think the candidate should be. But states also will be able to nominate candidates or suggest candidates, because remember, the choice of electors is in the states. So the states don't need to wait for these members of Congress to say, okay, here are your candidates, because people in the states may say, well, we want someone else, which is what happens in 1824. It becomes clear, well, Monroe isn't going to run again, so quite early, the congressional caucus, and we can think of these as kind of the insiders, choose as his successor. The likely choice is, anyone know? William H. Crawford, who is the Secretary of the Treasury. He is the favored candidate, and I think if early 1824, we probably would have put our money on Crawford from Georgia. He was the guy, remember, who led the campaign against the Yazoo land fraud back in the 1790s. Then he had been a school teacher. That campaign launched him onto a political career which is barely equaled in the bright page of the Republic's history. He's Secretary of the Treasury, very important post. His running mate is Albert Gallatin. And Gallatin, of course, had also been Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, for the last 24 years, one of these guys had been Secretary of the Treasury. So this seems like a really good team, because the economy is important. Who better than the Secretary of the Treasury? In many instances, that would be the case. And so this is the Congressional Caucus's choice. This is the administration's choice. Crawford, Gallatin. Everyone will be happy. Remember, the idea the Republicans had, as enunciated back in 1801 by President Jefferson, is to restrain men from injuring one another, otherwise leave them free to regulate their own pursuits. And these are really the guys. They're the anti-Hamilton, who wanted a big government that would oversee the economy. No, you don't need a government overseeing the economy. You need to get out of the way of all these smart entrepreneurs, which is what we've done for 24 years. Stayed out of your way. Now keep going. Well, there are qualifications in that we'll get to. Now, the legislatures of the New England states have another candidate in mind who's also a member of the cabinet, and this is John Quincy Adams. Okay, Secretary of State. And something worth bearing in mind is James Monroe had been Secretary of State, James Madison had been Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State. So if you're looking for something that qualifies someone to be president or is a stepping stone to the presidency, think Secretary of State. And the legislatures of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi have another candidate in mind. They like the general of the Southern armies, Andrew Jackson, senator from Tennessee, or one-time senator from Tennessee. So 3 legislatures say, we think Jackson should be. And then the legislatures of Kentucky, Virginia, and Ohio have their own candidate, the Speaker of the House. Interesting, the Congressional Caucus doesn't choose him, but the legislatures of Ohio, Kentucky, and Virginia do. Henry Clay. And Clay has this American system. He wants internal improvements that will bind the sections of the country together, to have a national program to build canals and roads and exploit these new technologies to create a national infrastructure. The American system, he calls it. Bold plan. Okay, the legislature of South Carolina and the legislature of Pennsylvania also have a candidate in mind. He's from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, but recognizing that he's probably not going to work here as a presidential candidate, he becomes the vice presidential candidate for both Andrew Jackson, the legislatures of Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi propose Jackson and Calhoun. The New England legislatures propose Adams and Calhoun. So Calhoun is the vice presidential nominee for both Jackson and Adams, because both Jackson and Adams see, Calhoun has a lot of support in South Carolina, and that's a good thing. Jackson also, incidentally, was born in South Carolina, so he's not as worried about that. What he is worried about is Pennsylvania. Okay, so both of them see Pennsylvania would be really good if we can have Calhoun on our ticket, and he is. So what you have here then are 4 different candidates really representing different parts of the country. Crawford is the only one who's really a national candidate, even though secretaries of the Treasury typically aren't really compelling, charismatic figures. And poor Crawford has a stroke halfway through this campaign and is incapacitated. There's some thought that he might actually be dead. And that certainly colors the campaign. As Crawford's out of the picture, what happens to people who otherwise would have supported him? Now, you have then 4 different candidates representing 4 different parts of the country. The one national candidate is really out of the picture. And this is also, incidentally, the first time in the history of the country that we have returns for the popular vote. States were able to choose presidential electors in whatever way they chose. At this point, most states had some kind of a popular vote as a way of determining who their electors should support, or whom their electors should support. It was whom, right, Karen? Whom their electors should support. Thanks. Okay, so Jackson gets about 150,000 popular votes. More importantly, he gets 99 electoral votes from the South and the West, from Alabama, Mississippi, those places. Adams gets a little over 100,000 votes, 84 electoral votes. Crawford and Clay are pretty close. Clay gets about 47,000 popular votes, Crawford 46,000. Crawford gets 41 electoral votes, and Clay gets about 37. You need 132 votes to be elected president, and no one has 132 votes. Except, of course, for John C. Calhoun, who has all of the Adams votes and all of the Jackson votes, and he is elected vice president. Okay? But no one's sure who the president will be. And then what happens when you have a case like this? You don't have anyone getting a majority of the electoral vote. the House of Representatives. So this is what the framers imagined would happen. Different parts of the country, the electors would propose candidates, and then the House of Representatives would choose among them. And interestingly enough, and they choose from among the top vote getters. So one guy whose name is not going to be before the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay. And speakers of the House do wield a certain amount of power in that body most of the time. And Henry Clay decides that he will support John Quincy Adams for president. So 13 states vote for Adams, 7 for Jackson, 4 vote for Crawford, and so Adams is elected president by the House of Representatives, which doesn't sit well with Andrew Jackson, who can count. He got about 150,000 votes. How about 50,000 more votes than John Quincy Adams did? So that's part of it. I got more votes. For him, the more important thing is Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, used his influence to get the House to elect Adams. And what do you know happened just after the election? Adams makes Clay the Secretary of State. And, well, actually, we have accounts of the first meeting between Jackson and Adams after the results of the House's vote were known. They meet actually at a reception at the White House, and they're quite cordial to one another. But this is, you can see, if you are Andrew Jackson and you're anticipating being president, you already have, running again, you already have a pretty good issue. These guys made a deal, a backroom deal, and that's not the way we should operate here, having someone exchanging favors, a corrupt bargain like this. Henry Clay. Clay had a reputation as being kind of an operator, yes.
Do we know if Adams actually did sort of bribe Clay with being secretary?
Okay, first, I think the building will shake at the possibility that an Adams might bribe anyone. No, he didn't bribe Clay. Clay had his own reasons for thinking, things would go better for him with Adams as president than with Jackson as president. Okay, because Adams and Clay shared a political philosophy about creating a national infrastructure. And neither one of them trusted Jackson. Jackson didn't think the federal government should be creating an infrastructure. Those things should be up to the states. What the federal government should do is keep doing what Jefferson had said. Leave people alone and stay out of their way. And if states want to build roads and canals, let the states build roads and canals. We're not going to bankrupt our children for the sake of creating canals so that a bunch of New England merchants can get their goods to market, or so that Henry Clay can build industries in Kentucky. If people in Kentucky want industries, let them build them. This is what made the country great, not having the government do things for you. I'm sorry, now I'm starting to feel like I should be running for office on this very platform. I hope someone's writing down everything I say. Oh, we're taping it. Good. Maybe that's not good. This is going to be on YouTube, right, where I start. Okay, so, this isn't what made the country great. Instead, let people do things on their own, not have, this kind of stuff. So, there's more of a affinity between Adams and Clay, certainly, than between Adams and Jackson or Clay and Jackson. Thomas Jefferson thought that Andrew Jackson was the most dangerous man in the country. And he remembered when Jefferson was vice president, Jackson had been a senator, and he said he could barely utter a sentence. He was so angry all the time. His face would turn red, and he would get all choked up. And Jefferson put a great stock on people being able to utter sentences without turning red and having their face getting all choked up with anger. So, there's certain, the more established folks are happier, I suppose, with Adams than they would have been with Jackson. And as I said, Clay and Adams have share a common ideology, although Adams and Clay had both been on the diplomatic team that had secured the treaty with England after the War of 1812, and Adams had made note of Clay's propensity to drink and to gamble. Henry Clay was known as the victor of many a hard-fought battle, and hail fellow all wet. And of course there's that great John Randolph of Roanoke, that brilliant madman, congressman, leader of the Republicans, once said about Henry Clay, like mackerel in the moonlight, he shines and stinks. So Adams, as president, proposes a bold system of internal improvements to bind the country together. And it is a visionary thing to have canals, roads, a national university. Actually, every president since Washington had proposed a national university. Now it seems as though we will have a national university because the country is getting quite prosperous. The tariff every year is bringing in about $22 million, while thanks to the idea of having a wise and frugal government, the government's only spending about $16 million. So there's a surplus every year of about $5 million. And what will you do with this? We've paid off the national debt. That program Jefferson and Gallatin had instituted back in 1801, despite the fact that we have had a war with Tripoli, a war with England, the purchase of Louisiana, has paid off the debt left over from the Revolutionary War, leaving our children and grandchildren free to pursue their own destiny without having to pay off the debt their parents and grandparents bestowed upon them. So this is a great thing. So what can you do with this surplus? Adams proposes roads, canals, a national university, even observatories, which he calls lighthouses of the heavens, so that we can study the sky. Now this all, to us, an audience here at this university, may think this sounds like a wonderful thing, but, well, if you are not here, you may say, well, we have $5 million extra, why not give it back? Why not distribute it among everyone? Why not eliminate the tariff altogether and have free trade so that then we can really benefit? Because what happens when you impose a tariff on something, it means you're producing something and you're selling it somewhere else. That other country is going to retaliate by putting a tariff on your goods. So that's one thing you could do if you have a high tariff. Well, that tariff isn't benefiting everyone equally. If, for example, you are producing cotton for the world market and hoping to sell the cotton in England, where they're manufacturing lots of textiles, they're also manufacturing other stuff that you might want to buy, the price of that stuff is going to go up because there's a tariff on it. And they are going to put a tariff on your cotton so that it won't sell as cheaply as it could if there were no tariff. So a tariff is going to benefit, who's it going to benefit, a tariff? Well, yeah, they're getting the money for it, so there are certain things we agree, $16 million a year is what they need. What about this other $5 million? Who's really getting the benefit of that? The people who are manufacturing things that are manufactured in competition with foreign manufacturers. Because now the government is putting a tax on imported cloth, for example, or imported manufactured goods, which you might want to buy, unless you happen to be manufacturing them on your own, in which case you want a high tariff so that people will be more inclined to buy your stuff than this imported stuff. So how is this fair, you might ask, if you're, say, growing cotton or having cotton grown on your plantation in South Carolina? How is it fair to have a high tariff that is benefiting the industries of New England and to the detriment of you? And, of course, New Englanders want you just to sell your cotton to them because they'll give you a lower price than you can get in England. But of course in England they're going to have a tariff because they can get cotton from India or from Egypt, another cotton producing place. So this is you can see an emerging issue here over the tariff. And should we use this surplus to build roads and canals and universities and lighthouses of the heavens? Or should we lower the tariff rate to let you decide what you're going to do with your own money? What should we do? Give all of this money to John Quincy Adams and the House of Representatives to decide what to do with it? Or let you folks decide what to do with it? Who wants a national university, by the way? Who wants lighthouses of the heavens? Poor John Quincy Adams never really sees it coming. Someone said that he lost the election of 1828 because he had written one too many books and learned one too many languages. The intellectual in politics, it usually doesn't end well. This is what happens in 1828. You have folks congressmen from South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, saying we should lower the tariff rate. Georgia actually thinks we should have a high tariff because Georgia has their own interest at work here. We'll see what happens. We have Congress proposing a tariff. And these really bright guys from the states who are against the tariff. There are two reasons for being against the tariff, of course. One is that reason I just gave you, because it's taking money from you and giving it to someone else. Taking money from you, South Carolina cotton planter, and giving it to Mr. New England cloth manufacturer or Mr. Pennsylvania ironmonger. Okay. That's one reason. The other reason is the philosophical free trade argument that Adam Smith had advanced back in 1776, that the wealth of nations isn't augmented by having a mercantilist policy that benefits the merchants of that nation. It benefits through free trade, which forces people to compete, and through competition you will achieve greater profits. That sounds like a great slogan. Better profits through competition. When Mike goes into business, he's going to have that on the side of the building. Okay, so there's a big discussion actually, Albert Gallatin is a great free trader. So he's on actually that side of this particular issue. But if you're an ironmonger from Pennsylvania or a manufacturer from Massachusetts, you likely will support a tariff because it benefits you, right? Your stuff is protected by a tariff. We could have the same discussion among auto manufacturers many times in the 20th century, or various other industries. Should they be protected or not? Okay, 1828, big discussion over the tariff. In fact, every year between the 1820s and about 1913, the big thing Congress discusses every year is the tariff rate. And the tariff on different things is going to be of great interest to you if you're in that particular segment of the economy. 1828, Congress is debating the tariff. The smart guys who really don't like the tariff, both for reasons of self-interest and political economy, have a good idea here. Just to show how absurd it is to try to protect industries by putting a high tariff on those particular goods that are being imported, we will jack up the tariff rate, to like 100% on some things. Just to show everyone how absurd it is to have a really high tariff. And if you say, we want a tariff for the purpose of protecting certain industries because, we want our ironmongers to be able to do well, and the only way they'll do well is if we protect them, well, why stop at a reasonable tariff? Why stop saying, okay, we're going to increase the price of imported iron by 10%? Why not double the price? Why not triple the price? We can go as high as we want, right? What stops us? This, I guess, is the big question. How high can Congress put the tariff?
We need it low enough. I'm sure some goods they need to import.
Well, need is a problem, because why do we really need to protect this guy in Pennsylvania growing iron. I mean, if he can do it more efficiently, he'll do it without our help. I mean, this is the idea of a government that will stop you from hurting each other, but otherwise leave you alone. Should it really say, okay, we really like this guy who's making iron in Pennsylvania, so we're going to make you pay more for iron so that we can help him out? That's the issue here. I'm not trying to get into an argument with you over the tariff, incidentally. You're trying to look at this in a balanced way and thinking, well, how high should it be? But there's this philosophical argument which says, why are these people in Congress making this particular decision about the marketplace? Or saying, we're going to protect him at the expense of you. And if you ever have to buy anything made of iron, you're going to have to pay more because we want to help him out. I'm going to make you a free trader before the end of the semester. That's actually my goal. I don't know if you saw that on the syllabus, but it was just on your copy. So how high should it be? And is there a limit to how high? Yes?
Maybe you can make it just high enough where no one really notices it and overall.
Well, that would be good. Make it, yeah, okay. Make it just high enough so no one really notices it. I think that would be ideal if you go along with this. Unless, you're an ideologue like me and like Gregorian will be before the end of the semester. Say, we don't want people really to notice it. But in this case, the ideologues say, well, why stop anywhere? If we accept the argument that this is a reasonable function of Congress to decide we're going to benefit this guy at the expense of all these people, why stop at 10% or 20%? Why not go to 100%, 200%? So this is what they do. They push the tariff up. As Congress is debating the tariff rates, these very unlikely guys are supporting higher and higher tariff rates, thinking this will make it so high. In fact, they know this is what's going to happen. If there is a high tariff, this will, they know this is what's happening. High tariff means people who are producing rice and cotton have to pay more for manufactured goods. This means it's more expensive for them to grow rice and cotton, also tobacco. And in fact, the markets for tobacco and rice are quite depressed at this time. People are leaving Virginia and Georgia, which produce rice and tobacco, going other places. So they're in decline, partly, and the tariff isn't helping. So they're moving away from these areas. And when people move away from your area, it means your political power declines and it's not coming back. This is something the New Englanders had seen back in 1814 when they had the Hartford Convention saying, okay, people are leaving New England. Now, of course, people are going to begin coming to New England because they're developing manufacturing and the federal government's helping them out with a tariff. So, just to get to what happens here, they push the tariff rate to absurdly high levels in 1828 so that they know no one possibly can support this because it's such an absurd tariff. It's an abominable tariff. But then, of course, if you're an ironmonger from Pennsylvania or a manufacturer from New England, you say, oh, wow, these tariff rates look pretty good. And the tariff passes. Absurdly high. These guys, they outsmart themselves. Bad thing to do if you're in Congress. You didn't think it was possible, did you, for members of Congress to outsmart themselves? But they do in this case. And they forced the tariff to absurd levels, and now they're really stuck. And then they really start to protest. And South Carolina has a state convention that draws up an exposition explaining South Carolina's position on the tariff. Not simply, and it is partly an economic issue, but it's also a constitutional issue. Now, no one knows at the time, but the author of the South Carolina exposition is actually Vice President Calhoun. And you'll remember, Calhoun had been quite popular in Pennsylvania. He had proposed that very bold internal improvement bill back in 1815 that President Madison wound up vetoing. But now he secretly, in 1828, writes the South Carolina Exposition, saying the power to tax, which Congress has the power to levy taxes, does not include the power to encourage manufacturers, to encourage certain parts of the economy. The power to regulate commerce also does not give Congress the power to encourage manufactures or to intervene in the economy. The confounding of these terms, Calhoun said, would lead to the most extravagant results, since the encouragement of domestic industry implies an absolute control over all the interests, resources, and pursuits of a people, and is not consistent with the idea of any other than a simple consolidated government. So if you accept this idea that Congress, through its power to levy taxes and through its power to regulate commerce, also has the power to encourage manufacturing or to encourage one segment of the economy over another, you then also have to accept the idea that Congress has an absolute control over all your interests, resources, and pursuits. Where will you draw the line? This is what the South Carolina exposition asks. And it goes on from this very principled stand about irresponsible power to the notion, the idea that irresponsible power is inconsistent with liberty and, in fact, will corrupt those who exercise it. This is really one of the fundamental problems in the Constitution. And the South Carolina exposition explains, from a diversity of interest in the several classes of people and sections of the country, laws act differently. So that the same law, though couched in general terms and apparently fair, shall in reality transfer the power and prosperity of one section or class to another. Right? So we have a tariff law. It says everyone has to pay this tariff on imported iron. It doesn't say people in South Carolina are going to have to pay more, but in fact they will, because they're not manufacturing iron, so it's not protecting them. Lori Lynn's so disgusted with this, she's shutting her computer. No more of Calhoun, she says. Okay, so you're transferring, yes?
I thought the tariffs would sort of be to keep prices of things manufactured within the U.S. down.
Tariffs would be to keep the prices of things manufactured within the United States. No, actually no, because if you know, in England they're manufacturing all of this cloth, which they can dump on the American market, okay? So you put a tariff on it. So let us suppose that I can buy a bolt of cloth manufactured in Birmingham for $10, but the tariff says I have to pay $20. That means if you're a manufacturer in Lowell and Lawrence, you can sell for, up to $18 now. So this is actually going to raise prices you are going to pay because, generally people in business aren't stupid. And they see what kind of a market this will be. It means there's a tax on it, which means I can actually charge more. And the tax is only on the stuff that's being imported. So if they, in England, can manufacture stuff more cheaply and look at, stuff manufactured in China. If we put a high tariff on it, yeah, there would be more people manufacturing all those little souvenirs and just about everything else. But anyway, this is getting us into areas I don't know a whole lot about, but no, it actually has the effect of raising prices on stuff made here. But the purpose is, in this case, to protect the people who are manufacturing things here from competition, in this case, from the British. And incidentally, in the 19th century, no one ever gets tired of competing with the British or doing something to hurt them, and a tariff is one way of doing it. So just telling you, if you find yourself transported back to the 1820s and want to find a way of arguing for or against a tariff, I could help you out, by the way. Did that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay. So then Calhoun goes from this economic argument to looking at the structure of the Constitution itself. From a diversity, so he says laws act differently, right? And transfer property. In such a case, responsibility to constituents, the congressman's responsibility to his constituents, which is but the means of enforcing the fidelity of representatives to them, must prove wholly insufficient to preserve the purity of public agents or the liberty of the country. In fact, it would be inapplicable to the evil. The disease is in the community itself. in the constituents, not in the representatives. This is really a bold thing, to attack the constituents instead of the jokers they elect. Okay? The opposing interest of the community would engender necessarily opposing hostile parties, organized in this very diversity of interest, the stronger of which would, if the government provided no efficient check, exercise unlimited and unrestrained power over the weaker. So where you have a majority that has part of its interest extorting stuff from this minority, there's not going to be a check on it because the majority rules. Okay? The relations of equality between them would be destroyed, and in its place would be substituted the relation of sovereign and subject. That our industry is controlled by the many instead of by one, by a majority in Congress elected by a majority in the community having an opposing interest instead of hereditary rulers, forms not the slightest mitigation of the evil. No government based on the naked principle that the majority ought to govern, however true the maxim in its proper sense and under proper restrictions, ever preserved its liberty even for a single generation. Those governments only which provide checks, which limit and restrain within proper bounds the power of the majority, have had a prolonged existence and been distinguished for virtue, power, and happiness. Constitutional government and the government of a majority are utterly incompatible. It being the sole purpose of a constitution to impose limitations and checks upon the majority. An unchecked majority is a despotism, and government is free and will be permanent in proportion to the number, complexity, and efficiency of the checks by which its powers are controlled. So, if you catch his drift, he doesn't like majority rule. It's incompatible with, what?
He doesn't like democracy either.
He doesn't like democracy. No, of course he doesn't like democracy, but that doesn't make him unusual. What he really doesn't like is government by the majority, because it's going to tyrannize over the minority. Calhoun actually develops these ideas quite systematically and to quite extent. By the way, how would you compare this to what Madison had said in Federalist 10 about, checks on the majority, diversity of interest, forming a check and needing to check the tyranny of the majority? I mean, that had been a dilemma in the 1780s. How do you constrain a majority or prevent majority tyranny? And it seems also to be a problem here in the 1820s and 1830s. And Calhoun sees this coming. Any thoughts on this?
Well, states were supposed to be like partially, and our system was supposed to be partly that.
Yeah.
I don't know, right?
Yeah.
It seems like the framers intended for the states to be.
That's true. The framers thought the states would be, but one thing Calhoun sees happening here, people are leaving South Carolina, going to other states, and the interest of South Carolina, and actually he also sees an alarming thing happening. The population of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois is expanding much faster than the population of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana can expand. Something that Henry Clay recognizes. Free labor is a bigger draw for immigrants than slave territories. And so what Calhoun sees is going to happen is the producing states, which he calls them, and incidentally, Calhoun insists this has nothing to do with slavery. But you can see that the producing states are going to be outnumbered by the manufacturing states, because you need a lot more people, you can use a lot more people in a factory in Lowell than you can on a cotton plantation in Mississippi. So you are going to have bigger population in the free states than in the slave states. They are going to outvote these folks. he calls them the producing states. Calhoun, incidentally, back in 1819 in the cabinet, John Quincy Adams and Calhoun, who actually had quite an interesting, a close relationship throughout their lives. Although Adams was really a difficult person, but he came to regard Calhoun as a crackpot, which in many ways, toward the end of his life, I have to confess, I think if you know anyone in South Carolina, don't tell them this. I have a good friend who teaches at the University of South Carolina, and he wrote an essay on Calhoun before he went there, and people didn't like it because he liked Calhoun. He said, "What about all that hair?" And but toward the end of his life, Calhoun developed this idea of a concurrent majority. The only way really to have this fair is to have, say, a candidate for president should have to get support not only from a majority of the electors, but from a majority of the electors within each section of the country. That is, you would have to have a majority among the minority as well as among the majority. And later he develops this idea that really there should be two presidents, so to represent the minority interest. And he was very articulate, and he was a brilliant constitutional thinker. But one thing you should know about brilliant constitutional thinkers, particularly when the Constitution has been written, is that they kind of become dogmatic. And Calhoun, the story is, would be talking to a group at a Washington cocktail party, and someone would ask about the concurrent majority idea, and he would start talking and talking and talking. And you've probably found yourself in a situation like this at a party where there's someone talking. You probably find yourself in a situation like this right now, where there's this one guy standing there talking, and you can't get away. And, if you're smart, you'll get away early, because then you see the group drifting away, and you don't want to be the last one standing there, because then there's no easy way to get away. But that wouldn't bother Calhoun. He would keep talking if the room was empty, not noticing that no one was there listening to his ideas on the concurrent majority. But his ideas actually have been resurrected, were resurrected in the late 20th century, this idea of a constitutional way to protect the interests of a minority. And you can see, for example, in the Cambridge elections, where people vote for a variety of candidates, ranking them. It's a way of guaranteeing that a minority, today we think of minorities strictly in racial terms, but Calhoun is thinking of a minority in economic terms or in geographic terms. Interestingly enough, too, he comes from a state where the minority actually does govern. And one reason he's aghast at majority rule is he knows what that would mean in South Carolina. Back in 1819, as I was saying, John Quincy Adams and Calhoun had a discussion in the cabinet, and Adams had said, look, eventually the line is going to be slavery versus no slavery. And Calhoun didn't think slavery was that big of an issue. He didn't see that happening. So I'm not sure if his elaboration of this theory of protecting the minority interest grew out of a need to protect the interests of slave owners. It does the implication his ideas will have the greatest resonance among slave owners, who were the ones producing cotton, tobacco, rice, opposing a high tariff, opposing internal improvements. As I said, Georgia had supported the high tariff before, because Georgia wanted internal improvements and also wanted to encourage the population to move from Virginia to South Carolina to Georgia. But after 1828, Congress debated financing the American Colonization Society, as Clay had this grand idea. I mentioned Adams having this grand idea. Clay has this idea of removing the black population and instead having immigrants come in to work in industries. And Georgia sees where this is going. This is really an attempt to end slavery. And so Georgia joins with South Carolina in 1828 in opposing this extension of federal power. So we see Calhoun elaborating an idea about, the power of the states, or the way of constraining a majority, and saying this actually comes out of the ideas of people like Madison. Madison, incidentally, is very much alive at this time, and Madison thinks that Calhoun is gone off the deep end and says, this isn't what I meant at all. And the response from the advocates of constraining the majority is, well, Madison's 80 years old now. He's really lost a lot up here, doesn't really understand all of this. So you have this big problem here developing. And, we can see the institution of slavery is being bound up in it, but also this economic argument over the tariff and this argument over majorities and minorities, and how do you keep this big country together when there are so many different interests at work. Now, I had a lot more I was going to say on this. I think I might do what Calhoun would have done, which is to keep talking and see if you all can find a discreet way of getting out of the room. So, or we can just say, I'll see you next week and continue the story.